Jasmine Crockett sat in the green room at CNN's Atlanta studio, the cold, sterile atmosphere pressing in around her. Her fingers tapped lightly on the armrest of the chair, the only sound in an otherwise quiet room. The polished floors, high ceilings, and lack of warmth in the space made it feel more like a waiting room than a place for conversation. Her assistant, Ree, poked her head inside. 2 minutes, she said briskly. You're up next. Jasmine exhaled, standing up and adjusting her powder blue blazer. Her reflection in the mirror was calm and composed, no cracks, no room for them. Not tonight. As she walked toward the stage, her heels clicked sharply against the cold marble floor. The walls around her were lined with black and white portraits of famous figures, men in suits, icons of authority, their faces staring down from the walls. She didn't know them, but their presence weighed heavily on her. Reaching the stage, she offered Jake Tapper a polite smile. He nodded slightly, a tight grin pulling at the corner of his mouth. He gestured to the seat across from him, where Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito sat, his face unreadable. The lights came up, and the audience's applause flickered. The show was live. Tapper leaned in with his characteristic grin. Our next guest is a rising Democratic Congresswoman from Texas, Jasmine Crockett. She's young, sharp, and possibly the future of the party. Unless emotion gets in the way, Tapper said, his words dripping with an almost unnoticeable challenge. A light chuckle rippled through the audience. Jasmine didn't flinch. Good to be here. Tapper continued, now introducing Justice Alito. The camera panned to the stoic figure, his nod curt. Let's start simple, Tapper said. Justice Alito, you've written extensively about originalism. Why do so many progressives, like Congresswoman Crockett, seem to reject this approach in favor of moralizing constitutional interpretation? Alito leaned forward, delivering his rehearsed line. The Constitution's text and original meaning provide clear guidance. When lawmakers insert personal values, they undermine the rule of law. He turned to Jasmine, his gaze sharp. It's about restraint versus activism. Jasmine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she blinked slowly, her calm demeanor never wavering. I think you mean recognizing how constitutional principles apply to those who weren't considered when it was written. Tapper smirked, clearly anticipating a return to the traditional back and forth. Right. But don't you think passion sometimes gets in the way of governance? There's a lot of yelling, not a lot of results. Another awkward laugh rippled through the audience. Jasmine didn't smile. I get it, she said calmly. Young people, especially young women, especially young black women, get labeled emotional when we care too much, or angry when we speak directly. Meanwhile, others can pound the bench, write scathing dissents, and it's passion. Interesting, isn't it? A shift happened in the room. The laughter faded. The audience sat in tension. Alito's expression tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, Jasmine continued, undeterred. You know, you've built a career on challenging precedent, but when a black woman does the same thing? She let her words hang in the air. Unspoken, but understood. The camera caught the brief flicker of surprise on Justice Alito's face. Tapper quickly tried to regain control. Okay, let's take the emotion out of it. Policy-wise, what's actually being done? Jasmine didn't miss a beat. That depends. Do you mean what's being proposed? Or what's being blocked? She leaned in, her voice firm. Voting rights. I helped draft legislation to make it easier for working people to vote. More polling places, stronger mail-in options, protections for those with disabilities. But every time we bring it up, someone calls it overreaching. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't the usual back and forth driven by sound bites. There were no forced laughs, no smirking jabs. Just two people facing off on something much deeper. Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to make a viral moment. She was there to speak the truth. And in that quiet room, she had just done that. Without raising her voice, without stepping out of line. The tension in the studio grew as Jake Tapper, trying to regain control of the conversation, shifted the tone. He leaned forward slightly, a half grin on his face as he asked Justice Alito the next question. So, Justice Alito, You've written extensively about originalism. Why do so many progressives, like Congresswoman Crockett, seem to reject this approach in favor of moralizing constitutional interpretation? Alito's face remained steady, his voice firm and measured. The Constitution's text and original meaning provide clear guidance. When lawmakers and activists insert personal values, they undermine the rule of law. He glanced at Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who had yet to respond. It's about restraint versus activism. Jasmine didn't respond right away. She blinked slowly, her gaze unwavering. There was no anger in her eyes, only calm calculation. She didn't rush to fill the silence. Instead, when she spoke, her voice was soft but direct, cutting through the air like a knife. I think you mean recognizing how constitutional principles apply to those who weren't considered when it was written. The words landed, not with a slam, but with a quiet impact that reverberated in the room. Justice Alito's expression tightened, but he did not respond immediately. Tapper, sensing the shift, quickly tried to steer the conversation back. Right. But don't you think that sometimes passion gets in the way of governance? There's a lot of yelling, not a lot of results. It's like everyone's trying to go viral instead of getting things done. A few chuckles rang out from the audience, the kind of nervous laughter that comes when the line between a joke and a jab isn't quite clear. Jasmine Crockett remained unfazed. She didn't smile. I get it, she said calmly, her tone even. Young people, especially young women, especially young black women, get labeled emotional when we care too much, or angry when we speak directly. Meanwhile, others can pound the bench, write scathing dissents. And it's passion. Interesting, isn't it? The room quieted. The audience felt it, the subtle but powerful shift in the dynamic. It wasn't just the words Jasmine spoke. It was the way she said them, with such poise and control, that made them impossible to ignore. Justice Alito shifted in his seat, his discomfort starting to show. He wasn't used to being the one on the defensive, especially not on national television. He crossed his legs, leaning forward slightly, clearly intent on pushing back. You're making this about identity, he said, trying to reframe the discussion. I'm talking about constitutional interpretation, about legal consistency. Jasmine Crockett didn't miss a beat. She countered with precision. And I'm telling you that you can't separate identity from interpretation. If you spend your life watching your community get overlooked, underfunded, and blamed for problems you didn't create, what do you expect them to sound like when they finally get the chance to make change? Her words hung in the air, a challenge to the very foundation of the conversation. The audience grew quieter, as if they too were waiting for the next move. Justice Alito, realizing he couldn't dismiss her points, tried to steer the conversation back to his preferred narrative. But isn't that the problem? The legislative branch becomes a platform for personal grievances instead of a forum for making laws. Jasmine smiled faintly, not because she thought it was funny, but because she knew the setup was too easy. You know what's wild? She said, leaning in slightly. It's always been a stage. You just never noticed when the same people were writing every act. Now that someone new is reading from the script, suddenly it's performative. The words landed like a thunderclap. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and for the first time, Justice Alito faltered. He reached for his water, trying to regain his composure. Jasmine Crockett hadn't just outmaneuvered him. She had shown the world a truth they weren't ready to hear. As the conversation unfolded, the room grew heavier with each passing moment. The audience had been expecting a political debate, but what they were witnessing felt different. It wasn't just a clash of opinions. It was a battle for space, for voice, and for truth. Justice Alito, visibly uncomfortable, shifted in his seat. His attempts to dismiss Jasmine Crockett's points were falling flat, but he wasn't ready to back down. He leaned forward again, his voice more forceful this time, as if he thought that strength and tone would regain the control he was losing. You're making this personal, Alito said, trying to pull the conversation back to his preferred narrative. I'm talking about the Constitution, about upholding the original meaning and structure of our laws. We need to protect the integrity of the legal system, not let individual emotions shape it. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She had anticipated this. She knew he would attempt to frame the debate in terms of law and order, hoping to sideline the very real human consequences of those laws. But she wasn't interested in that kind of narrow framing. "I'm not making this personal," she responded, her voice steady and unwavering. "I'm talking about people. People who live the consequences of those laws every day. You can talk about originalism all you want, but the Constitution was written at a time when most of us were invisible. You can't ignore that." Alito's eyes narrowed slightly, and he shifted again, clearly frustrated. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, certainly not on live television. The words didn't have the same effect when they were coming from someone like Jasmine, who refused to be dismissed. "The problem," he continued, "is that the legislative branch is becoming a platform for personal grievances rather than a forum for serious policymaking. Congress is supposed to be about lawmaking, not making statements." Jasmine paused, taking a moment to let the words sink in before she spoke again. There was no rush, no need for dramatic flair. Her response came quietly, but with undeniable power. "You're right," she said. "Congress is supposed to make laws, but for too long the laws have been made to favor a small group of people while leaving others behind. It's easy to call it activism when you've never had to fight for your seat at the table." The audience was on the edge of their seats now. Jasmine Crockett had stripped away the veneer of civility that often masks deeper issues in political debates. This wasn't just about policy, it was about who gets to define the policy and who gets left out. And for the first time, the studio audience understood exactly what she was fighting for. Her calm, deliberate tone contrasted sharply with the tension building in the room. Alito, clearly rattled, tried to regain control. "This is not about fairness or justice," he said. "It's about consistency. The law cannot bend to the whims of passion." Jasmine Crockett's response was immediate. "What you call passion, I call the fight for justice. And for many of us, justice has never been a given. It's something we've had to demand, even when it's uncomfortable for people like you." The tension was palpable now, the air thick with the weight of their words. Jasmine's quiet strength was winning this battle, not because she was shouting louder, but because she was speaking the truth with clarity, and Justice Alito knew it. The audience was no longer laughing nervously. They were listening, and in that moment, Jasmine Crockett had done more than make a political point. She had taken control of the narrative. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted. What had started as a political debate, a back-and-forth exchange of ideas, had become something much more intense. The audience was no longer just a passive group of observers. They were part of the unfolding drama, drawn in by the quiet power of Jasmine Crockett's words. Justice Alito, his frustration mounting, leaned back in his chair, clearly trying to regain his composure. His posture stiffened, his fingers tapping on the armrest of his seat. He had been caught off guard, his arguments slowly unraveling under Jasmine's calm, unflinching responses. It wasn't supposed to be like this. He had expected to dominate the conversation, to assert his legal principles with authority. Instead, he found himself reacting to her, his own discomfort growing. "Look," Alito said, trying once again to steer the conversation back to familiar territory. "The legislative branch is there to pass laws, not to serve as a platform for personal grievances. We need to be focused on legal consistency, not on emotional appeals." Jasmine Crockett listened intently, her eyes never leaving him. She had been expecting this, the attempt to frame the discussion as one of legality versus emotion, but she wasn't going to let it slide. She leaned forward slightly, not enough to appear confrontational, but enough to claim the space around her. "Justice Alito," she said, her voice calm but sharp, "when you say personal grievances, you're dismissing real people's experiences. This isn't just about emotions. This is about people whose voices have been silenced for centuries. You want to talk about legal consistency, but what you really mean is protecting a system that has worked for a select few while leaving the rest of us behind." The words hung in the air, the weight of them impossible to ignore. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but rather pregnant with the realization that Jasmine had just laid bare the core of the debate. The audience was no longer laughing. The few smirks that had appeared earlier had vanished. People were leaning forward, their eyes fixed on the screen, sensing that something important was unfolding before them. Alito's expression faltered, just for a moment. His next words came more slowly, the smugness that had once defined his tone, now replaced by something else, frustration, perhaps, or uncertainty. "But that's not what this is about," he said, his voice tight. "The law is about consistency, about upholding the principles of the Constitution. It's not about making exceptions for every grievance." Jasmine Crockett remained unfazed. Her eyes, steady and focused, never wavered as she responded. "It's easy to talk about consistency when you've never had to fight for your seat at the table. When you've never had to fight just to be seen, to be heard. The law may be consistent, but it hasn't always been fair." Justice Alito shifted in his seat again, his gaze briefly darting to the camera. The moment was slipping away from him. His usual tactics of dismissing his opponents with legal jargon were no longer working. Jasmine Crockett had shifted the conversation from a debate about law to a fight for fairness, for justice, for people who had been left behind. The camera lingered on his face, capturing the subtle shift in his expression. He was no longer the confident, unshakable justice he had been when the segment began. He was human, vulnerable in a way he hadn't expected, and it was clear that Jasmine Crockett had exposed something deeper than just a disagreement over constitutional interpretation. The studio was eerily silent, the kind of quiet that happens when an audience senses that something monumental is unfolding before their eyes. It wasn't just a political debate anymore. It had become a moment of reckoning. Jasmine Crockett had already proven herself as an unflinching force, but now she was playing her final hand. Justice Alito's discomfort was evident. He had tried every angle to regain control of the conversation, to steer it back to his comfortable zone of legal theories and historical references, but Jasmine had repeatedly dismantled his arguments with precision and clarity. She had turned every question he asked into an opportunity to expose the real-world consequences of the laws he so staunchly defended. But now, she had him. She had shifted the debate in a way that even he couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about constitutional interpretation. It was about the people who lived under that interpretation. And Jasmine had made it clear that those people weren't just numbers or abstract concepts. They were real, living, breathing human beings who had been ignored for far too long. As the silence dragged on, Justice Alito cleared his throat, his frustration boiling just beneath the surface. He leaned back in his chair, trying to collect his thoughts. But the words were no longer coming as easily as they had at the beginning of the conversation. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said, his voice tight, "you talk about these issues as if they are personal attacks, but the law is about consistency. The Constitution doesn't change based on emotions or personal experience." Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't need to. She'd already proven that she wasn't here for a fight about semantics. She was here for something bigger. She had already spoken the truth that so many were too afraid to say, and she wasn't about to back down now. "It's easy to talk about consistency when you've never had to live under a system that wasn't built for you," she replied, her voice calm but full of purpose. "It's easy to talk about laws when you've never had to fight for your right to even exist within those laws." There was a slight shift in the room, a subtle but undeniable shift. Jasmine's words were powerful, not because she was shouting, but because she was speaking a truth that many had never been forced to confront. The quiet power in her voice was louder than any scream. She wasn't trying to change Alito's mind. She was making sure everyone in that room and everyone watching at home heard her. Alito, clearly rattled, tried to recover. "I never said the system is perfect," he muttered, his confidence faltering. "But that doesn't mean we should abandon the framework entirely." Jasmine Crockett didn't let him off the hook. "I'm not saying we abandon the system. I'm saying we fix it. We take a hard look at the structures that are hurting people, and we make sure those people get a seat at the table, not just when it's convenient, but every time." The tension in the room reached a boiling point. It wasn't just about who was right or wrong anymore. It was about who was willing to stand up for what was just, even when it wasn't popular, even when it wasn't comfortable. Jasmine had shown them all that it was possible to stand firm, to speak the truth without ever raising your voice. The camera lingered on Justice Alito's face, a small flicker of realization passing over his features. He knew that he had lost this round. Not because he didn't have the facts or the law on his side, but because Jasmine had shifted the focus to something he couldn't easily dismiss, the human cost of the decisions he had spent his career defending. And as the camera cut away, Jasmine Crockett sat back in her chair, calm as ever. She didn't need to say anything more. The message had been sent, and it was one that would echo long after the show ended. The lights dimmed, the applause faded, and the camera cut to black. The conversation on air may have ended, but the reverberations of Jasmine Crockett's words lingered long after the broadcast concluded. As the production crew packed up and the studio began to empty, Jasmine sat in her seat for a moment longer, still composed, still unshaken. But the calm she wore was only a mask for the intensity she felt inside. She had stepped into that studio with a clear purpose to challenge the narrative, to call out the inconsistencies in the system, and to speak truth to power. But she knew, too, that the moment she left that stage, the battle wouldn't be over. It would only be beginning. Her assistant, Ree, rushed into the dressing room, wide-eyed and holding her phone. "You're trending," Ree said breathlessly. Jasmine raised an eyebrow, already peeling off her microphone. "I'm peeling off my mic already. 2 on X and climbing," Ree added, passing the phone to her. Jasmine glanced at the screen. Mentions were flooding in, along with clips of the debate. The 15-second clips of her calm response, "I'm not being small," were being turned into viral GIFs, overlaid with dramatic music. And bold white font flashing, "Say that again." The comments were flooding in, some supportive, others critical, but all demanding a response. "They're going to twist it," Ree muttered, sensing the media storm on the horizon. Jasmine sighed, but there was no panic in her. She knew the game by now. "Let them," she said, her voice steady. "The message is clear." As they walked out of the studio, Jasmine was bombarded by text messages and calls. Friends from Dallas were reaching out to her, some praising her, others just saying, "Damn." Her mother texted, "You were raised right. That man thought he had you figured out." It felt good to hear the praise, but Jasmine didn't let it go to her head. Praise was fleeting. What mattered now was how the world would shape this moment. Would they see it for what it truly was? Or would they reduce it to yet another viral moment, a soundbite stripped of its meaning? Back at the hotel, Jasmine plopped onto the couch, flipping through her phone and watching the media circus unfold. The talking heads were already debating her performance. One pundit said, "This is why Democrats struggle. They alienate people with this tone." Another countered, "She didn't raise her voice once. She was surgical." Jasmine's lips quirked slightly at the comments. She didn't care about the tone they were discussing. It wasn't about the tone. It was about the message. She had been clear and direct, and that was enough. As the night wore on, Ree brought her more messages and interview requests. Jasmine didn't respond to any of them. She knew the drill by now. The media wanted her to react. They wanted her to rise to the bait, to go viral again. But she had learned not to play that game. Instead, she scrolled through her social media, her eyes stopping on one post in particular. A young high school girl from Columbus, Ohio, holding up a sticky note with Jasmine's quote, "I'm not being small." Jasmine read the words, and for a brief moment, she felt a warmth in her chest. This was bigger than television appearances and viral clips. This was real. The world might not have known it yet, but Jasmine had already won. She wasn't just changing the conversation. She was changing the way people saw themselves, their voices, their power, and their ability to stand up, not with anger, but with clarity. The conversation had shifted, and it wasn't going back. The following morning, Jasmine Crockett woke to the familiar hum of her phone, buzzing with messages from all directions. The media storm she had predicted was well underway, but this time, it wasn't just the talking heads or political pundits dominating the conversation. It was the people, the regular citizens whose voices often went unheard and their words were louder than ever. Ree stood by the coffee machine, his laptop open, scanning the latest headlines. "Another wave of interview requests," he said, glancing up. "MSNBC, NPR, even independent outlets. People want you everywhere." Jasmine rubbed her temples. She had known this moment was coming. She had known it would be big, but now, the gravity of it was beginning to set in. The response wasn't just about a single debate or a viral moment. It was about the way people were connecting with her message. For some, it was the first time They felt truly seen. The quote, "I'm not being small," was everywhere, posted on social media, written on sticky notes, repeated in conversations at kitchen tables across the country. Her thoughts were interrupted by a text from her mother. "You were raised right. That man thought he had you figured out." A small smile crossed Jasmine's face. She could almost hear her mother's voice, proud and steady. But as the day went on, she couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was unfolding. This wasn't just about a political win. It was about something much larger, a shift in the way people saw themselves in spaces where they had been silenced. Her phone pinged again, and she glanced at a message from a teacher in her district. "I played your clip in my classroom today. It wasn't about politics, but about standing up for yourself. We need more of that." Jasmine paused, letting the message sink in. She had spoken for so many people who had never been given permission to claim their space. The message wasn't just political, it was universal. And that was what made it so powerful. She wasn't just confronting the system. She was speaking to anyone who had ever been told to shrink themselves to fit someone else's idea of how they should act or be. She scrolled through more posts, stories from women in corporate offices, teachers in classrooms, and workers in communities who had been dismissed and overlooked. Many shared how they had felt inspired by Jasmine's calm and unwavering response. "You gave me the courage to speak up at work," one post said. Another shared, "I've been told to smile more, talk less. Your words gave me the strength to stop apologizing for taking up space." The weight of it hit her. This was bigger than her. It was about all those people who had been made to feel small, who had been told their passion was too much, their voices too loud, their presence too demanding. They had all seen something in Jasmine Crockett that they could relate to, the quiet strength to stand firm without shrinking. At the same time, the backlash was growing louder. Media outlets, particularly conservative ones, had latched onto the viral clip, calling her aggressive and divisive. But Jasmine didn't respond to the critics. She had learned long ago that the louder the backlash, the stronger the message. She sat at her desk, her thoughts swirling. It wasn't the headlines or viral moments that mattered. It was what happened next. The real work had always been in the quiet moments, the conversations in town halls, the emails from constituents, the stories shared in small groups. That night, she reflected on the impact of her words. The movement was just beginning. She hadn't just made a political statement. She had ignited something. And that's when it became clear. It wasn't just about her message anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been told to shrink. The next step wasn't about running from the moment, but making sure that it kept growing. The weeks following the debate felt like a whirlwind. Jasmine Crockett had braced herself for the media frenzy. But what she hadn't anticipated was the profound impact her words had on people across the nation. The viral clip of her calm but powerful response, "I'm not being small," had become a symbol, not just for her, but for anyone who had ever been told to shrink themselves. Her phone buzzed constantly, but the messages she received weren't just from the usual political circles. They were from regular people, mothers, teachers, young students, and professional souls, sharing how Jasmine's words had given them the courage to speak out and claim their space. One morning, she found a handwritten letter waiting for her at the office. It was from a retired teacher in Arkansas. "I've spent my life being told to tone it down," the letter read. "Your words, your calm strength, have given me permission to take up space again. I've spent too long making myself small. Thank you for showing me it's okay to stand tall." Tears welled in Jasmine's eyes as she read the letter. This wasn't just about politics. It wasn't about who won the debate or who made the best point. It was about people, real people, who were no longer afraid to speak up, to be heard, and to fight for their place in the world. The media coverage, of course, hadn't stopped. Headlines continued to pour in, some still focusing on her clapback and others praising her poised demeanor. Jasmine knew the media cycle would eventually move on to the next controversy, the next big story. But what mattered more to her were the quiet moments, the messages from young girls who now felt empowered to speak their minds, the workers who felt validated in their struggles, the mothers who could now tell their daughters that they didn't have to be small to be seen. One afternoon, she met with a group of interns who had come to Washington, eager to learn about politics. One of them, a young woman from a small town, hesitated before asking, "Congresswoman, How do you handle it? How do you keep your cool when everyone is trying to tear you down? Jasmine smiled softly, the weight of her experience shaping her words. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. You don't need to be loud to make a difference. What matters is what you say, and whether you have the courage to stand by it, even when it's uncomfortable. It's about knowing your worth and not letting anyone take that from you. The young woman nodded, her eyes wide with understanding. Jasmine saw the reflection of her younger self in that girl's gazia, young woman just beginning to realize the power in her own voice. Later that day, as Jasmine sat in her office, looking out over the National Mall, she thought about the long road ahead. The country was far from perfect, and the work she had started was only a small part of the greater fight for justice. But in that moment, she realized something. The real shift wasn't just about changing laws or policy, it was about changing how people saw themselves. Her words, her quiet strength, had become a reminder that you don't need permission to be whole. You don't need applause to be right, and you sure as hell don't need to make yourself smaller to fit in. As the day wound down, Jasmine leaned back in her chair, a soft smile on her face. The battle wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning, but she was ready. As time passed, Jasmine Crockett's words continued to resonate. The viral clip faded from the headlines, but the impact lingered. The conversation sparked by that moment had shifted from the screen to everyday lives, leaving a lasting imprint on those who had witnessed it. People who had been silenced for too long were now finding their voices. Jasmine had given them more than just a quote. She had given them permission to stand firm, to take up space unapologetically. In quiet moments, Jasmine reflected on what it all meant. It wasn't about winning debates or being right. It was about creating change that lasted beyond the news cycle, beyond the moment. It was about inspiring others to keep fighting, even when it felt like the world was against them. Her journey had just begun, but now, Jasmine knew she wasn't alone. The movement was already bigger than her, and that, she realized, was the real victory.